trip over that. There's a little step there, so you get past that. Okay? You're
All right,
good to
thank
go.
you very much. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched a massive campaign against the American front in the Ardennes Forest on the German-Belgian border. And in a single day, German panzer and infantry divisions overwhelmed U.S. defenses along a 45-mile line. Hitler's troops were abetted by one of the coldest winters of deep snows ever recorded for the region. The American army was completely unprepared, the result of a gross failure of intelligence. Hitler planned the Ardennes campaign, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, as a turning point of the war in the West. By Christmas Eve, the Germans had advanced 65 miles, creating a bulge in the Allied lines, which gave the battle its name. 3 German armies of 250,000 troops and almost 1,000 tanks and assault guns smashed through the American defenses, disintegrating the front lines. And it was not until January the 25th, 1945, that the Allied command was able to push the Germans back to their frontier and to erase the Bulge. The Ardennes is an ancient northern European forest, about 80 miles in length. It is an isolated, hilly, forested terrain which extends westward across Belgium from the German border toward the Meuse or Maas River and the border of France. During the winter, it consists of freezing rain, stinging sleet, blankets of fresh snow, and here is a GI in the Ardennes before the coming of the snows, but when the snows come, blankets of fresh snow at times are whipped by blizzard winds which make any movement by men or machine extremely difficult. And for most of the next week or two, the members of the infantry units will spend much of their days inching forward like this, low on their stomachs, snaking through the snow as German machine guns sprayed the fields. The short, wintry days are engulfed by heavy fogs and an eternal grayness which creates an era of gloom. The Ardennes sector of the Western Front was known by the GIs as the Ghost Front. The major roads through the forests are paved, but many of the secondary roads are narrow dirt tracks which meander through the mountains. The Ardennes offensive was the brainchild of Adolf Hitler. And in a conversation with Chief of the Army Albert Jodl, Jodl told Hitler that only 4 American divisions were holding the front along the Ardennes. And Hitler identified the Ardennes with a very successful panzer drive across the mountains to the Meuse River, which led to the fall of France in 1940 at the beginning of World War II. Hitler reasoned that the alliance between the United States and Britain was weak and fragile, and that the Allies could be split by a German offensive across the Ardennes to the French border, and then by a German drive northwest to the port of Antwerp, which was the major American supply port. By December 1944, the Allies were not far from the borders of Germany and the Rhine River. Hitler then conceived of Operation Autumn Mist, which was a code name for the General Ardennes Offensive, Watch on the Rhine. And it was planned on 2 of the principles of war, on secrecy and on speed, to assemble a massive force on the border without alerting Allied intelligence, and to reach the Meuse River within 4 days before the Allies began to shift their forces to contain the northern and southern flanks of the Bulge, with its tip pointing to the Meuse River bridges near Liège. The Allied High Command did not expect an attack through the Ardennes. In fact, a SHAEF intelligence summary, and SHAEF is the acronym for Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. A SHAEF intelligence summary of December 16 reported that, quote, "The enemy is at present fighting a defensive campaign on all fronts. His situation is such that he cannot stage major offensive operations." But the Germans were able, secretly, to amass an invasion force of 2 very large panzer armies. And if discovered, the Germans thought that the Allies would consider it as a German defense force to protect the area along Aachen and Cologne against any Allied invasion of Germany. The German buildup was centered in the Schnee-Eifel Mountains in the northern part of the Bulge, opposite the Ardennes. So moving by night, the Germans spread straw on the roads to muffle their movement, and they sent fighters low over the American lines to drown out the sound of thousands and thousands of tanks and vehicles which were assembled for the offensive. The start of the operation was also planned to take advantage of the weather. December 16 was a bitter, cold, misty morning with 6 inches of snow on the ground, and the sun was hidden as it would be for the coming week. To assure the success of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler assigned all available German forces and materiel, tanks and infantry units, which were not needed on the Eastern Front against the Russians. 3 armies were scheduled to participate in the offensive. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, under the command of SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, and in the south, a weak 7th Army to protect the southern flank of the offensive against any possible American counterattack from the south, in other words, from Patton's 3rd Army. And Field Marshal Walter Model was appointed senior field commander for the Ardennes. So from north, the 6th Panzer Army, in the center, the 5th Panzer Army, and in the south, the 7th Infantry Army. The American armies, which were destined to fight the Battle of the Bulge, were under the command of General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, and here is Bradley on the left with Eisenhower. The 12th Army Group included the 9th Army under General Simpson in the north, the 1st Army under General Hodges in the center, and in the south, General Patton's 3rd Army. So from north to south, the 3 American armies were deployed from Holland and along the German-Belgian border to Luxembourg and along the German border of the Saar River in the south. The forested terrain of the Ardennes is situated in the center of this long frontier. This was the Gauss Front. It was commanded by Major General Troy Middleton's 7th Corps, and the 7th Corps was given the task of preparing for the invasion of Germany and the crossing of the Rhine. For this reason, but Middleton at the time happened to be in Washington. And it was clear, at least the Americans thought, that the area of the Ardennes was strategically unsuitable for any military operation, either on the ground or on the air, especially during the extreme winter conditions. For this reason, the Ghost Front was held by only 4 or 5 understaffed and widely dispersed green U.S. divisions. The veteran divisions of the 1st and 9th Armies, which had fought across France, Belgium, and Holland, were taken off the line for rest and rehabilitation after the bloody campaigns of the Ruhr and the Ardennes Forest. In the south, Patton himself was preparing for an offensive against the highly fortified line of the Siegfried Line with Frankfurt as his objective, and this was scheduled for December 19. But Hitler's Ardennes offensive intervened on December 16. At a senior staff meeting of Army Group commanders, Bradley's 12th Corps and Montgomery's 25th had met with General Eisenhower at Maastricht in the Dutch Panhandle on December 7 to discuss the upcoming Rhine campaign. Montgomery pressed for a narrow, focused, restricted campaign in the Ruhr Valley by his British 21st Army Group. Eisenhower, however, favored a broader strategic plan by Bradley's American 12th Army Group to carry the war directly into Germany by crossing the Rhine River. The participants at the meeting took note of the buildup of Germany's 6th Panzer Army, which was being deployed along the German frontier of the Ardennes, but the German panzers were thought to be in the area for the defense of the Rhine and the Cologne region of Germany. The senior Allied commanders disregarded the Third Army's G2 report of the German buildup. Patton had passed the intelligence about the 6th Panzer Army onto Eisenhower's G2, which informed Bradley's 1st Army G2. But Bradley and his senior staff were convinced that a German offensive through the Ardennes was highly impracticable and even foolhardy. And he considered the German buildup as the defense of the Rhine against any Allied operation aimed at the German homeland. And Bradley's later comment was, "Where in hell has the son of a bitch gotten all his strength?" By their failure to read the intelligence and anticipate the offensive, Eisenhower and Bradley lost confidence in their leadership. Eisenhower was then persuaded to place the U.S. 1st Army and the U.S. 9th Army under Montgomery's British command in the northern sector, while Montgomery kept embarrassing the Allied command by his tactless remarks, which tended to downplay the American contribution to the battle by exaggerating his own part. And when he continued to press for his own appointment as the Supreme Land Forces Commander with Bradley's American 12th Army Group under his own British 21st Army Group, Eisenhower threatened to ask for his resignation. But Montgomery withdrew his demand. The German strategy called for the offensive, the 3 armies to be deployed, the 6th, 5th, and 7th to be deployed along a 37-mile front with the heaviest units on the north in the right flank of the Bulge, spearheaded by Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army. This route was the northern route, afforded the shortest distance and the most direct route to the border of France and the bridges over the river. It included 60% of all available German armor for the offensive. In the center of the front, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, its mission was to protect the left flank of the 6th Panther Army's thrust in the north. And the south was assigned to the German 7th Infantry Army, which essentially had no armor, and its mission was to protect the southern border of the Bulge against any possible thrust northward by Patton's Third Army. When Hitler proposed this Ardennes offensive, most senior German officers doubted the success of the strategy. Some of these officers proposed among themselves a less grand strategy with a more practical goal. But this strategy, limited, was not brought to Hitler's attention because, as Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who predicted that an offensive would create a deep salient, and of course he meant a bulge, in the Allied line, it would be costly and an indecisive bulge, and then he did not bring it to Hitler's attention because, as he said, he knew that Hitler would reject it. Von Rundstedt later remarked, "It was obvious to me that the available forces were far too small. In fact, no soldier really believed that the aim of reaching Antwerp was really practicable. But I knew by now that it was useless to protest to Hitler about the possibility of anything." The German officers referred to Hitler's strategy as the big solution, and to their limited one as the little solution, the kleine Lösung. The German offensive began with a massive pre-dawn artillery barrage on December 16. This was the heaviest bombardment that even veterans had experienced. Out of the morning darkness came German shock troops, followed closely by columns of tanks, powerful panzer and panzer grenadier units, many of them bearing the jagged double SS. German tanks were superior to those of the Allies, but there were not enough of them, and it was the quantity of available tanks rather than the quality which made the difference. Here are Germans passing a tank, American POWs passing a German tank. Here are GIs, the Germans on one of their own tanks, but it is, and here's the difference between a Panther and a Sherman. And here is the most powerful tank built in World War II. It was built by the Germans to counter any future Soviet tank. This is the Tiger tank, but it was difficult to maneuver this monster on the Ardennes battlefield, which limited its effectiveness. And here GIs inspect a knocked out German tank. Here is a Sherman, which had slid into the ditch, and all of these tanks, all they had to do was just slide a couple of inches off these narrow roads, and they were dead. Here is a knocked out Sherman tank, and here are 3 Shermans on the battlefield. And here is an example of how the tanks had to maneuver, a Sherman tank trying to maneuver in very heavy snow. The Germans overran and annihilated 2 weak U.S. divisions on line, and American commanders were then forced to use small, dispersed units, which managed to escape capture and to conduct a gradual slow-motion retreat in the face of the advancing Germans on both the Saint-Vith salient, which was in the northern flank of the Bulge, and the Bastogne salient, which was in the middle of the Bulge. But in the process, U.S. units suffered very, very heavy casualties as they were pushed back from roadblock to roadblock and from village to village. The German advance was also harassed by American small unit firepower, rifle, BAR, mortar, machine gun, and bazooka power. Here is an American bazooka team. Here is a GI with a submachine gun. Here is a mortar section of an infantry company. And here is the baby of the American arsenal, a GI with the Garand. The M1 rifle was although the baby of the battle, it was a very accurate baby. And then here are GIs with their M1s on their shoulders going into an attack. And then whatever artillery was available to stop the German advance had to be brought into play, like this 105 howitzer. In the north, U.S. units were able to stop the German advance by defending the main roadblocks and the rail junction of Saint-Vith at the eastern part of the northern border of the Bulge, thus preventing the Germans from sending reinforcements and supplies, especially gasoline, to their spearhead units, a few of which had reached the vicinity of the French border by breaking through a gap of just above Bastogne. In the center of the Bulge, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army broke through the American defense and overwhelmed 2 regiments of the newly arrived 106th Infantry Division, and this was the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in Europe during World War II. The annihilation of the 106th opened the gap through which some German units continued their advance to the French border, where they were forced, however, to await fuel and supplies. But the gap through the American lines was not complete because U.S. units were able to defend with very dogged determination and very, very heavy losses the crossroads which led to the town of Bastogne. The German units which opened the gap were forced to bypass the town. Here is a fog-shrouded infantry column on the march. Here GIs try to seek cover in a forest. Here GIs try to dig in poorly defensive positions, try to break into the hard ground, which was difficult because of the weather. And the GI at the bottom of this image was just killed. Some GIs tried to escape, but very few of them were able to do that. Here again are American GIs on their long trek to prison camps. Many died on the way with little food. Some tried to escape, but few succeeded. And here is a young POW, obviously in shock. And here an American column passes through a battered village. This was a very common scene throughout the Ardennes, with muddy ground and dull, cold weather. And here is a U.S. tank destroyer which tries to negotiate a muddy road. And here is the most important weapon of the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. This is the German 88 launcher. The German 88 gun was the most famous weapon of World War II. It appeared in a series of forms, ranging from originally an anti-aircraft gun, but it was also used as an anti-tank gun, and it was also used as a tank gun mounted on a Tiger II tank. And although it was primarily an anti-aircraft gun, it became the deadliest anti-tank weapon of the war. The GIs call it the Screaming Mimes, because these multiple rocket launchers were the deadliest effective indirect fire weapons in the German arsenal. And they were used by the Germans, however, against the Geneva Conventions, against ground troops. And it is the shrapnel of one of these 88s, which does not prevent me from standing up straight, because small pieces of the 88 are still embedded in my lower spine. And it is the shrapnel from the 88 which gave me my first Purple Heart. Included in his strategy to seize the river bridges before they could be destroyed by the retreating Germans, Hitler devised two special operations. Operation Hawk, Sturzer, and Operation Candor, Greif. The purpose of these special operations was to spread confusion in the American rear by sabotage. The first of these, Operation Hawk, called for a brigade of paratroopers to be dropped deep within the U.S. lines to seize the bridges over the Meuse River and to prevent the Americans from reinforcing their front. To confuse the Americans, a drop of dummy parachutists preceded the real one to give the impression that the airdrop was larger than it was. The jump, however, was hindered by heavy crosswinds. In fact, one unit fell 50 kilometers behind German lines. The operation was checked by American forces a few miles from the Meuse River, and when the German colonel assembled his men, he found that the number was far too small to hold any of the bridges, and he ordered his paratroopers to make their way back to the German lines, and many of these were captured and killed as spies. Many of these so-called Yankee Germans were executed. Operation Hawk obviously was an unqualified military failure. And when the German colonel asked where the American fuel reserves were, because the strategy of the Battle of the Bulge was based on the capture of American fuel dumps, he was told, "You will learn what forces the Americans will use against you." The German offensive was based on the capture of American fuel dumps. Here is a vast American fuel dump, more than 400,000 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline lining 5 miles of roadway, which were assembled in preparation for the Rhine campaign. And here are the remains of a gasoline dump after American troops set fire to it by retreating units. When the colonel complained to his SS commander that both the wooded terrain and the weather made Operation Hawk a doomed mission, he was told that Hitler's orders were unalterable. The second operation, Operation Candor, was planned to infiltrate behind American lines before the arrival of the main panzer armies in order to conduct reconnaissance and such diversionary activity as spreading rumors, destroying bridges, misdirecting traffic by switching road signs, and cutting communications lines. And for this, Hitler appointed his favorite commando, Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who was ordered to assemble a special deception panzer brigade of English-speaking German troops wearing American uniforms and carrying false identification papers. But only about a dozen German soldiers were found with colloquial American English and a knowledge of slang who could pass as Americans, and another 300 who spoke passable English with an American accent. The commandos were given intense English language training. They were taught how to chew gum and how to cuss with American gestures. And the best of them were formed into an elite commando unit. The Panzer Brigade comprised about 2,500 men. It had a dozen captured Sherman tanks, assault guns, jeeps and trucks, and 5 Panther tanks, which were modified to look like American M10 tank destroyers. And the lead Panther of Skorzeny's brigade hit a mine, and later 2 GIs showed the tank's phony American star painted on it. About 150 volunteers with a better knowledge of American English were also organized into Jeep teams to serve as demolition squads, to issue false orders, and to rearrange road signs. GIs were also warned to challenge any suspicious soldiers they encountered in the forest by asking them questions about U.S. sports, like who won the 1944 Rose Bowl game, or questions about Hollywood, like what was the name of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, or trivia questions, which would be known only by somebody living in the United States, like what is the hometown of Little Abner? And although one of the Jeep teams reached the Meuse River, it failed to secure the bridges. And General Bradley later summarized the success of Operation Candor when he said, 500,000 GIs were forced to play cat and mouse with each other each time they met on the road. And among the incidents involving Skorzeny's Deception Brigade, Brigadier General Bruce Clark was arrested near Saint-Vith by an MP who was told to watch out for a crowd posing as a one-star general. And when he asked Clark about the Chicago Cubs, the general assigned them to the American League, to which the MP replied, only a kraut would make a mistake like that. General Bradley himself was detained by an MP who did not accept Springfield as the capital of Illinois. He was sure it was Chicago. At another stop, Bradley was asked to name Betty Grable's latest husband. And of course, he drew a blank. But the MP let him pass when he answered the backup question, who is the starting shortstop for the Cleveland Indians? Many of these so-called Yankee Germans were executed as spies. Here's the dead German wearing an American uniform over a German one. On the afternoon of the first day of the offensive, December 16, Skorzény's Panzer Brigade was bogged down in the massive traffic jams on these narrow roads, which also hindered the panzers, and many of them fell into ditches and were unable to maneuver. Skorzeny realized that Operation Candor was not able to carry out its mission by moving ahead of the main Panzer Army, and he was authorized to reconstitute his brigade as a regular combat unit to capture the crossroad town of Malmedy, which had been bypassed in the northern part of the Bulge. As an infantry sergeant of the 30th Division, I challenged a lone, suspicious-looking character near the village of Stablo, which was just north of Malmedy, to give the password. He mumbled and reached for his weapon, which I shot out of his hand. He was wearing a double uniform, an American over a German one. I sent him to the rear to be bandaged, where he was interrogated and executed as a spy, as many of these so-called Yankee Germans were executed as spies. The Belgian town of Malmedy was the scene of the infamous execution of American POWs one day after the beginning of the German offensive. On December 17, the Germans machine gunned GI prisoners at a crossroads near Malmedy. And the lead unit of the 1st SS Panzer Division, which was Hitler's own premier unit of the SS, and the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army on the northern flank of the Bulge, it was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. Peiper was an adjutant of Heinrich Himmler. Peiper's objective was to open a gap in the American line through which to lead his tanks, personnel carriers, artillery, and anti-aircraft guns. And this narrow line, red line, indicates Peiper's task force, but his troops were cut off by units of the 30th Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, and supporting units. They were cut off for 3 days, but they had to pull back to this oval. The American units had to pull back to this oval fortified goose egg, where, however, they were threatened by the Germans, and they had to withdraw westward through the egg to the safety of the lines of the 82nd Airborne. By the second day of the offensive, Peiper was already 12 hours late, behind schedule. He ran into determined opposition from American small unit armed power. And when confronted by Peiper's lead unit at a crossroads, members of the 86th Engineer Battalion sought cover in ditches like these along the road. The Germans fired machine guns into the ditches, forcing the Americans to surrender. About 113 POWs were then assembled in a field near a cafe. Here's one GI that tried to escape, but he didn't make it. The American POWs were assembled in a field, and for unexplained reasons, the Germans opened fire on the American prisoners who were closely massed in the field. And those who were still alive were shot at close range. The bodies of the American soldiers lay snowbound, buried and frozen in a no man's land until January the 4th, 1945, when they were found by units of the 30th Infantry Division after the German retreat from the area. And the bodies were rediscovered by mine detectors. Autopsies on the bodies revealed that, quote, terrible and usually fatal injuries were administered to the victims at close range. You hear U.S. soldiers lie by their anti-tank gun, shot by Piper's Panzer Brigade in an unequal battle. And here, German soldiers loot American corpses. And notice that the GIs are barefoot. Both the geography and the weather and the terrain were ill-suited for the movement of these fuel-guzzling tanks, which required both infantry and artillery support. And on both sides of this battle, both the artillery and the infantry support was inadequate. The advanced units of Dietrich's 6th Panther Army were halted not only by the U.S. defense of the major approaches to the key town in the north of Saint-Vith, but also by the congested roads and the German fuel shortage. And it is Saint-Vith in the north, which was a critical initial objective of the German offensive, and it was the failure of Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army to take Saint-Vith on the first and second day of the offensive that helped to stop the German drive to the French border. So blocked in the northern sector of the Bulge, the battle for the Battle of Saint-Vith, German activity then shifted to the central front of the Bulge around Bastogne, which was commanded by von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Now, once the Allies overcame their surprise and realized the seriousness of the German threat, General Eisenhower called up 4 veteran divisions which were in reserve for rest and rehabilitation during the Christmas period. He called up the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions and the 28th and 30th Infantry Division. The 101st Airborne was an elite all-volunteer outfit whose paratroopers were known as the Screaming Eagles. And their commander was Major General Maxwell Taylor, but he was in Washington at the time, and the acting CO was this quiet, self-effacing artillery officer, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, here with General Patton. And during the night of December 18, the entire division of the 101st was moved by hundreds of 2.5-ton trucks from its R&R base in France into Belgium. Bastogne at the time was serving as the U.S. 8th Corps preparing plans for the invasion of Germany. But they had to move out as the 101st moved in, and of course, that created a monumental traffic jam, and the Germans also experienced traffic problems when commanding Major General Fritz Bayerlein, who was an old Africa Corps officer, asked Belgian civilians which road led to Bastogne. they directed him down the wrong road. Here is an aerial view of Bastogne showing the spider web of roads that converged on the town. And here are civilians fleeing west to avoid the fighting, and the civilians of Belgium suffered tremendous deprivations during the winter. When the fog cleared about 10:30 a.m. on December 18, the small American units, which were the remains of the units which had been annihilated by the German offensive 2 days before the arrival of the 101st into Bastogne, these troops now encountered the leading units of the German offensive in the villages just east and north of the town of Bastogne. The Americans opened fire. The Germans threw in heavy artillery, forcing the Americans to pull back into the town, but many of them, Americans, were captured and killed. General Eisenhower and his senior commanders realized that the German offensive was more serious than expected or anticipated. And on the situation maps in both the Allied and German High Command headquarters, the grease pencil arrows highlighted the town of Bastogne, while the situation in and around the town was confused for both the defending Americans and for the attacking Germans. And as village after village fell to the Germans, it was clear that Bastogne would be surrounded. But when the Germans failed to take the town, they bypassed it and resumed their drive to the Meuse River. To stop the German offensive, Eisenhower needed Patton's Third Army. It was geared to attack eastward into the valley of the Saar River. It was held up by the Siegfried Line, and in order to shift his army toward Bastogne, Patton would have to make a 90-degree turn to the north over more than 100 miles of roads with 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles. At this point, there was an army group which did not participate in the Battle of the Bulge. The 6th Army Group, which was commanded by Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, and it comprised the U.S. 7th Army and the 1st French Army, a force of about 300,000 men, landed in Marseille in August on what was called the Second D-Day, and it advanced from the coast to Strasbourg on the Upper Rhine. And the force was equipped with bridging equipment, assault boats, amphibious trucks, and it was prepared to cross the river and swing behind the German First Army, which faced Patton's Third Army in Lorraine. This move would have forced the Third Army, then freed the Third Army to cross into Germany as Patton was prepared to do. But Devers' scouts reported there was nobody in those pillboxes on the other side of the river, and a successful American crossing at that time in the Upper Rhine would have dealt a devastating blow to German morale. But Eisenhower ordered Devers to keep his 6th Army Group on the west bank of the Rhine. Eisenhower's decision was a gross strategic failure because it delayed the Allied crossing of the Rhine until March 1945. Eisenhower's decision was probably based on his own broad front mentality, with all Allied armies moving in tandem on a solid front against Germany's industrial heartland of the Ruhr in the north. And Devers' crossing, in Eisenhower's mind, was far to the south of the Ruhr. It was probable that Eisenhower lacked the creative strategic mentality to take a calculated risk by allowing Lehrer's Sixth Army to cross the Rhine and perhaps end the war 6 months earlier. After its futile efforts to take the French fortress city of Metz in the south, Patton's army then came to a halt, and it was that point that he was ordered by Eisenhower to swing his army from the east to the north and to help in the defense of Bastogne. At this point, the clouded skies still prevented any air activity, and the only real activity in the air was by the so-called V bombs, the overflight of the German buzz bombs, which were launched nightly above the clouded skies, and were aimed at Antwerp and across the Channel at London and other English targets. The V in the V1 and V2 stands for the German word vengeance weapons. This was one of Hitler's secret weapons to win the war. The Vs were the first long-range ballistic missiles prepared for warfare. They packed a 2,200-pound warhead with a range of 200 miles, but the Vs were an almost total failure as a military weapon. They were more effective psychologically than physically. No one heard them coming as they fell to earth, and because the guidance system was not accurate, many fell into the sea. Historically, the Vs represent, however, the dawn of the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Some of these crude early missiles fell far short of their targets. In fact, one exploded on Christmas Day in 1945 on the American Field Hospital in Liège. It shattered the roof and the walls, which fell onto GIs like myself, who were under treatment for their battle wounds, resulting in fresh wounds for which we received a second Purple Heart. Lieutenant General Patton obviously was a controversial soldier with a great ego, which contrasted with Eisenhower and Bradley's understated professionalism. And when the Germans launched their attack, Patton was preparing an eastern offensive to cross the upper Rhine River, but he was then ordered to swivel his troops north for a thrust against the southern portion of the Bulge to relieve Bastogne. And when a British liaison officer on his staff asked Patton if he had any message for Field Marshal Montgomery, Patton glared at the man and replied in his salty language, "You tell Montgomery that the Third Army is attacking north, and for him to get out of the way because I'm going to run the German army up his ass." On December the 22nd, McAuliffe received word in Bastogne of Patton's drive from the south and the promise of a supply airlift as soon as the weather cleared. At 11:30 a.m., 2 Germans arrived at the Bastogne headquarters under a white flag with a surrender offer. It was a typed message demanding the honorable surrender of the encircled town of Bastogne, and it gave the Americans 2 hours to reply. When McAuliffe asked his aide, "What does it say, Ted?" The aide answered, "They want you to surrender." "Nuts!" the general barked. "Well, I don't know what to tell them," he added. And one of his officers replied, "That first crack of yours would be pretty hard to beat." "What was that?" the general asked. "You said nuts." So a laconic reply was sent, to the German commander, "Nuts," signed the American commander. And when the reply reached the German commander, he asked, "Was ist das nuts?" The battle raged all around the perimeter of Bastogne as German tanks and infantry pounded the besieged Americans and attacked the roadblocks leading to the town. But the defense held, and McAuliffe's artillery smashed attack after attack until the arrival of clear weather and U.S. gliders, which landed west of the town with doctors. And in the afternoon, Patton's advance units advanced on the road leading to Bastogne. And when McAuliffe met the officer of the first unit to reach the town, he greeted the captain with his laconic reply, "Gee, I am mighty glad to see you." The defense of Bastogne has become the stuff of legend, but it was the series of unsung minor battles to protect the crossroads leading to the town which made the defense possible. Without the little battles by small infantry and artillery units and the heavy, very heavy losses which they incurred, there would have been no Bastogne to defend. And the same summer scenario applies to the defense of Saint-Vith in the northern sector of the Bulge. By Christmas 1944, the Germans lost their offensive drive on both the northern and the central sectors of the front, but not before a few panzer units had reached the vicinity of the French border, but they were stopped because the supply trucks could not get through with the gasoline. By this time, the outcome was clear. It was not a matter of the defeat of the German Ardennes offensive, but when and how long it would take. By January 25, 1945, the Allies reached the frontier of Germany. The Bulge was erased. And what the Germans left behind were a series of graffiti. This one reads, "The Fuhrer gives us orders, we will obey," which is a fitting graffito by a zealous SS Hitler Youth. This poster reads, "Victory at any cost." And this one, "The dream is over," which is a fitting comment on Hitler's Ardennes offensive. Many books and articles have been written about the execution of American POWs at Malmedy on December 17. Colonel Piper and members of his battle group were found guilty because they did, quote, "willfully, deliberately, wrongfully permit, encourage, aid, abet, and participate in the killing, shooting, ill treatment, abuse, and torture of Americans of the armed forces of the United States of America." He and his supporters and lieutenants were sentenced to death by hanging, but the sentence was never carried out. The prisoners were released 10 years later, with Piper the last one to leave prison. But military historians conclude that it was the rush to judgment at the Dachau trial which resulted in incomplete and inadequate or flawed evidence which assured that guilty men escaped punishment. Under what circumstances were the American POWs executed, and who was responsible for it? No acceptable evidence was presented at the trial of a premeditated execution. Units of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, which were in the vicinity of Malmedy at the time, heard about it, and they were ordered to take no prisoners. The order was verbal, no written order was ever found. And as an infantry sergeant of the 30th Division, I was told by my company commander that American POWs were executed at close range with their hands tied behind their backs, and they were barefoot. And he added, no prisoners were to be taken alive in retaliation for the execution. And as the company moved past the crossroads, I saw evidence of mass bodies slightly covered by the falling snow, GIs frozen and barefoot. 68 years later, it seems impossible to affirm or deny what happened at Malmedy, but military historians accept as fact that American POWs were executed at Malmedy on December 17, 1944. And this Belgian memorial at the Crossroads Cemetery bears the names of 84 American soldiers and the U.S. Eagle watches over them. In conclusion, among the many reasons for the failure of Hitler's Ardennes offensive are the failure of German tactical and logistic support to keep up with the spearhead units, the chronic lack of German fuel supply, the failure of the panzers to maintain their initial momentum, which was hampered by both the terrain and the weather, especially around the key salients of Saint-Vith and Malmedy. The speed of U.S. small unit tactical response and the very rapid commitment of American reserves, both of which surprised the Germans. But above all, it was the dogged American defense which was greater than the Germans had expected. The Battle of the Bulge was the last great clash of armor in the West in World War II. Hitler used his last panzer reserves in an effort to stop the Allied advance. The German tanks were, as I said, superior to the Allies, but there were not enough of them. The German Panther had a more powerful gun and better frontal armor and armament protection than the American Sherman. And the Tiger II was the most powerful tank built in the war. In the battle, however, the American Sherman prevailed because we had more of them, and the Sherman was used by our command in support of infantry units. After the end of the war in Europe, in May 1945, an American GI wrote this analysis of the Battle of the Bulge from the point of view of the enlisted man. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the hardest, if not the hardest, fight of the Allied armies in Europe. The weather, the terrain, the enemy combined to make a campaign of peculiar bitterness and difficulty. And when the enemy was finally forced back, by far the largest credit must go to the men who shouldered rifles, who carried machine guns, BARs, bazookas, and mortars in freezing weather, who plunged through knee-deep and waist-high snow, who dug foxholes in ground as hard as steel and cleared out woods as dark as night in the middle of the day. By Christmas Day 1944, the initiative passed from the Germans to the Americans, and instead of reacting to the German offensive, the Americans resumed their general offensive strategy to cross the Ruhr and the Saar rivers, strategy which was put on hold by the German offensive. For both the Americans and the Germans, the cost of the Battle of the Bulge was very, very high. 600,000 American troops were engaged in the battle, of which there were 81,000 casualties, and this included 20,000 killed in action, 40,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. For the Germans, 30,000 were killed in action, 40,000 wounded, and thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed. The Battle of the Bulge was the biggest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. It was the largest and bloodiest American land battle of World War II, and it was the costliest battle in all of American history. And this image exemplifies the battle in very simple terms. Here is a medic who drags a wounded GI strapped on a stretcher, set on runners toward an aid station across a snowy battlefield. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Battle of the Bulge as I experienced it as a soldier and as I researched it as a military historian. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, whoa, I'm sorry, that's very loud. We have time for a few questions, so please raise your hand and I will call on you, and then I'll repeat the question so that everyone can hear it, and with how loud this microphone is, I don't think that will be a problem. I'll start with this young lady in the front of the theater.
Why were the people who murdered the American soldiers in Malmedy released after 10 years? How did that happen?
The question is, why were those that were accused and tried and convicted of the Malmedy massacre, why were they released years later?
They were released because in the court there was no evidence that there was any premeditated execution. And that was the charge brought against the Germans in the first place. But the court decided that there was not enough evidence to support that conclusion. So many of them were in jail while the case was being adjudicated, and they were then released. But I'm happy to say that Piper got it in the end. He moved from Germany to a small village in France. The locals in that village knew who he was. They set fire to his house, and he burned to death.
The gentleman in the back with the, you, sir.
Yes, sir. Dr. Jameson, a lot of the images we see through film like The Band of Brothers and things like that always show that the GIs didn't have proper clothing at the battlefield. They didn't have the winter outfits. Why was that? Did you find some reasons we didn't have the proper winter clothing at the time?
Yes, that's very true. Where were our overcoats? I had to steal sheets off beds, tablecloths off tables in order to give my men in the foxholes. Why did we not have the wherewithal to live through a cold winter? Because Bradley said that the Germans would not come through the Ardennes. So the quartermaster orders were still in the United States. They did not arrive until after the Battle of the Bulge.
The gentleman right here.
Is that correct understanding when we said the paratroopers missed their targets often by 50 kilometers in the German line? Some of them were captured and executed as Nazi Yankees, is that correct?
The question is regarding the paratroopers that were dropped and even landed behind their own lines in Germany versus those executed that were wearing American uniforms.
You had two elements there. They were part of the special operations to create sabotage. And the paratroopers, the one unit that was dropped 50 miles behind German lines was forced by the winds. That was only one unit of many units of the paratrooper organization. Most of those paratroopers did land behind American lines, and most of them were in double uniforms. And the wearing of double uniforms is against the Geneva Convention, and it was on that basis that they were executed as spies.
Dr. Bischoff?
Yeah, what I'd be interested in, sir, is where your picture material comes from. Is this of U.S. Army Signal Corps, or is it private picture?
The question is, where are your resource materials from? The photographs, are they U.S. Army? Are they Signal Corps?
All of the above. Many of them are from the Army records, from the Army units. Some of them I got in Germany from German sources. Many of them, and some of the most important, I got from Belgian authorities in the small towns that were involved in the Battle of the Bulge.
This gentleman in the front row?
Yeah, Andy, when's the last time you went back to that ground, to the battlefield?
There's a psychology here. I'm trying to investigate it now. For many, many years, GIs who fought in World War II said nothing about it. They didn't tell their wives, they didn't tell their children, anything. Forget the damn battle. We've got a life to live. It's only toward the end of their lives that they began to talk about it, but by that time, many of them were dead. I myself could not do it. And it was not until last year that I was able, 68 years later, to visit the sites of the Battle of the Bulge and the northern border of the Bulge. And in the small town of Stablo, where I was first wounded, the mayor of the town made me an honorary citizen. So that shows you that we did win the Battle of the Bulge.
Last question here, sir.
Yes, Professor Jameson, has anyone done research to contrast other possible German strategies? In other words, suppose all those German units and so forth had stayed back and taken a more defensive posture, what might the outcome have been if that had taken place?
The question is there any research out there on what might have been the what-ifs of World War II, but specifically regarding the Battle of the Bulge, if they had used those forces to protect Germany rather than use them for an offensive?
There are two possible answers to that. One, the first answer is Hitler was running the war. And you could not tell, as von Brunstedt said, anything to Hitler. So there was no examination of that kind. Very recently now, I'm collecting bibliographies written by Germans on World War II who were fought in the Battle of the Bulge. But you see, those people would have to be very, very old, as old as I am, in fact, in order to say anything. Most of them are dead, because I was one of the last to be drafted at my age group who saw frontline service in the Battle of the Bulge.
Thank you, Dr. Jameson.
Yeah, this is good.